So we just finished talking about one thing that can control remodeling, and that is mechanical and gravitational forces. So that, remember, if you, the little thing I told you to remember is if you stress a bone, it will grow. And so anytime you apply more stress, you're going to get more growth. And anytime you remove the stress, the bone is going to stop growing or even shrink. So if you stress a bone, it will grow. If you remove the stress, it's going to stop growing. But there's one other reason why we can have remodeling, and that has to do with the calcium in the blood. So let's look at blood calcium just a little bit. So when you look at bones, now we already talked about this. I guess we haven't finished. So let's look at this first. So if you stress a bone, it's going to grow. Well, how does it grow? Well, here's what happens. Remember, here is our endosteum, and there are osteoblasts and osteoclasts in this membrane. So here are the osteoblasts, and here's osteoclasts, and they're in this membrane. And remember what happens if you apply stress. You're going to get these tiny little electrical fields. And that electricity is going to go here, and it's going to cause these osteoblasts to become stimulated. So the osteoblasts are going to begin to secrete matrix. And look what happens. We added new bone right here. This is new bone. And if you keep stressing it, we're going to add another layer of new bone right here. And if you keep stressing it, we're going to add another layer of new bone. So look what happened. This blood vessel used to be on the outside of the bone. This was in the periosteum. It was outside. But what happened is when you stress the bone, we wind up growing the bone. And look, as it approaches the blood vessel, what happens is it surrounds the blood vessel. But we're going to keep growing bone in here until eventually it's going to look like this. Same thing's going to happen to this blood vessel. Look, we're going to start adding bone here, and that blood vessel is going to get enclosed in bone just like the last one. So if you're thinking about what we started with, the blood vessels are out here, and if the bone grows this way, we're going to encompass those blood vessels. And look what happened. We created a brand new osteon here. And so if you create osteons all around the bone, so we're going to create another one here, and another one here, and another one here, all the way around at this periosteum. As we create these new osteons, this whole thing is going to get bigger. And again, that's because of stress. So here's where the stress has been applied. And so when we do that, the cells here, the osteoblasts, remember, are going to be activated by those tiny little electrical fields. And the osteoblasts are going to lay down bone until, look, the blood vessel is completely enclosed in bone. And if we keep adding stress, it's going to continue to happen. And so we're going to get more blood vessels enclosed in bone. And so we're going to create new osteons. We're going to get one here, we're going to get one here, and it happens, we're going to get one here. And so the bone is going to get thicker in diameter. And then this is what's going to happen. So if we look, this grew to this. And then this grew to this, and so on. But look what else happened. If we back up, remember what happens is if you don't stress a bone, what happens is it's going to go away. So if you remove the stress from bone, it's going to diminish the density. So if you don't exercise, or you spend a lot of time in the water, or in bed rest, or if you're an astronaut and you're traveling in space where there's no gravity, the stress goes down. And if the stress goes down, we're going to remove bone. And so what's going to happen is we're going to start out with it looking like this, but now there's no stress. And when you have no stress, you activate osteoclasts. And so look what happens. The osteoclasts begin to eat away the bone. They begin to eat away the bone. And so we're removing bone. We're removing it. And look what's happening. We're actually destroying osteons. And so eventually what's going to happen is we're going to start out here, but we're eating away the bone, and we're eating it away, and we're eating it away, and it's going to wind up being much smaller than it was before. The same thing's going to happen in here. If we stress the bone on the inside, it'll grow. But if we remove the stress, it'll shrink. So if we look at here, look, we added stress on the outside, but remember the stressors are only on the outside. They're not in the middle. We remove the stress here. And when you remove the stress, you're going to remove the bone. So we're going to build bone out here and remove bone in here until eventually it's going to look like this instead of looking like that. It has to do with these stressors. So if you look at an infant's bones versus a child's bone, look what happened. The outside got bigger, but so did the hole. The hole got bigger too. Until eventually when you reach adulthood, we went from a hole this size, a medullary canal, to a medullary canal this size. We went from a collar this size to a collar this size. And again, it's all because of stress. If you stress a bone, it will grow. If you remove the stress, it will shrink. And that's exactly what happened when we remodeled this bone. We also remodeled the bone because it got longer. So look at this bone here. This is what we started with, but it grew. It got longer. So look, there's my epiphyseal plate right here. But now the thing got longer, so the epiphyseal plate is up here. But bones don't just get longer. They have to reshape themselves. Look, that was our original shape right there. That was the original shape. But look, now this is the shape. Here's the shape out here. So look what had to happen. We had to go from this right here to this. So we had to add bone. But look, we had to go from this to this. We had to remove bone. So all along here, look what's happening. We're adding bone where stress is occurring, and we're removing bone where there's no stress. And so look what happened to the shape of the bone. It was this dotted line, now it's this one. So look, this bone, all of that was removed. But here, all of this was added. But here, look, we had to remove this bone. Again, it's about stress. So one more time, remember, if you stress a bone, what's going to happen to it? What's going to happen if you stress a bone? What is it going to do? It's going to grow. And again, it's because of those tiny little electrical fields. And what they're going to do is they're going to stimulate osteoblasts. And so we're going to get growth. But what happens if you stop stressing a bone? If you stop stressing, if you don't stress, what's going to happen? it's going to shrink. It's going to shrink. The bone, it will shrink. And the reason that happens is because without stress, there are no electrical fields. And when you have no electrical fields, that stimulates osteoclasts, and they remove the bone. Does this make sense to everyone? Now, if you're looking at the PowerPoint, you can click on this and it'll take you to a little short video and you can watch this thing that we just saw happen in real time. So again, stress grows. No stress shrinks. No stress shrinks. It has to do with this. And then here's our remodeling units. So look, stress is over here. So we're going to activate these cells and they're going to lay down new bone. But there's no stress over here. And so we're going to activate these cells. And these cells are going to remove bone. So we can add bone where we need it and remove bone where we don't need it. So that's one thing that controls remodeling. Mechanical, that means movement, and gravitational forces, stress. But there's another reason, and that has to do with blood calcium. So let's look at blood calcium a little bit. So first of all, when you look at the calcium that's in the body, almost all of it, 99% of the calcium, is in the bones. That only leaves 1%. There's only 1% of the calcium. That's free calcium. All of the other is bound up in the skeleton. So the only calcium we can do anything else with is this free calcium, this 1%. And if you measure it in the blood, it ranges between 9 and 11 milligrams. 9 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. So in other words, ideal is about 10. But it goes up when we eat it, and it goes down when we don't have any food, and it goes up and it goes down and it goes up and it goes down. If you look at that, that's negative feedback. Hopefully you remember that from the very first day. Well, there are two hormones that cause this to change. One of them is calcitonin and one of them is PTH. One of them is going to make it go up and one of them is going to make it go down. So if it falls like this, we're going to release PTH, and PTH is going to make it go back up again. But if it gets too high, we're going to release calcitonin, and calcitonin is going to make it go back down again. So it's tightly regulated between these two hormones. But remember, we're not talking about body calcium, because remember, most of that is in the bones. We're talking about blood calcium, just that 1% that's floating around in your blood. And that blood calcium is necessary for a lot of different things. Without blood calcium, nerves don't work. Without blood calcium, muscles don't work. Even your blood won't clot, it won't coagulate. You can't even do cell division. So this free calcium, this blood calcium, is really, really, really important. So we don't want it to get too low, but we also don't want it to get too high. So again, there's perfect right there. That's about 10 milligrams per deciliter. But it doesn't stay that way because we eat calcium. I had yogurt this morning. You eat it. And if you eat calcium, calcium goes up. Well, we don't want it to get too high, so we bring it back down. But if you haven't had anything like that for a while, calcium tends to fall. But we don't want it to fall too low, and so we're going to do something to bring it back up. And again, two hormones are involved. One of them is PTH, and the other one is calcitonin. PTH raises blood calcium. It makes it go up. And calcitonin lowers blood calcium. It makes it go down. So if it's too high, I'm going to release calcitonin. If it's too low, I'm going to release PTH. Again, PTH raises blood calcium. Calcitonin lowers blood calcium. Any questions so far? Well, look, in order to do that, these have to have target tissues. In other words, calcitonin and PTH have a tissue that they go to and they make something happen. That's called the target. And both of them have the same three target tissues. The same three. There's the gut, there's bone, and there's the kidney. Well, let's go back. Remember what their job is. Calcitonin lowers blood calcium, and it has three targets. It has the gut, it has bone, and it has the kidney. So think about this. I want my blood calcium to go down. It's too high. So what can I do? So at the bone, what I can do is I can take it out of the blood and put it into the bone. So in other words, I'm going to take it out of my pocket and I'm going to put it into the bank. So if I do that, if I take it out of the blood and put it into the bone, blood calcium will go down. Over here at the gut is where I get calcium. We can't make it, we have to eat it. When you eat it, you can either absorb it or you can just let it go on by and it will wind up in your feces. But look, I want to get rid of calcium. So even if I did eat it, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to absorb it. If I don't absorb it, it's not going to go into my blood, and so blood calcium and levels will fall over time. And then here's the kidney. And what the kidney can do is it can excrete calcium. In other words, it can take it out of the blood and put it into your urine. And so look, I'm trying to get rid of calcium. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to excrete more. So in other words, I'm going to take it out of the blood, put it into the urine. So in the blood, it's going to go down. So look, calcitonin does all three of these things. It goes to the kidney. It makes me excrete it. It goes to the gut. It makes me absorb less of it. And it goes to the bone and makes me take it out of the blood and put it into the bone. Store it. And so all three of these things are going to cause blood calcium to go down. But here's this other one. PTH makes blood calcium go up. It increases blood calcium. It has the same three target tissues. There's the gut, there's bone, and there's the kidney. So remember with the bone, it's like a bank. So I need some of that calcium that's in the bank. So I'm going to take it from the bone and I'm going to put it in the blood. And if I do that, what's going to happen is the blood calcium is going to go up. Same thing here. Remember the gut. The gut is where I absorb it. And I can choose to absorb it more or just let it go on by in the feces. And so what I'm going to do here, I want blood calcium to rise. I'm going to increase absorption. And so more is going to go into the blood, so blood calcium is going to go up. And at the kidney, remember, it's about excretion. Taking it out of the blood and putting it into the kidney. So what I'm going to do is decrease excretion. So it'll stay in the blood. So blood calcium levels will go up. So if we look at it here, look, this is what's happening. Blood calcium levels are too low. Blood calcium levels are too high. So if they're too high, I'm going to release calcitonin. It's going to go to those three targets: bone, gut, and kidney. And what's going to happen? I'm going to put more into the bone. I'm going to absorb less. I'm going to excrete more. All those things are going to make blood calcium levels come back down. And then here, blood calcium levels are too low, so I'm going to release PTH. It's also going to go to bone. It's going to go to the gut. And it's going to go to the kidney. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull it out of the bone and put it into the blood. I'm going to absorb more of what I eat, and I'm going to excrete less. And all three of those things are going to make blood calcium go back up. So let's look at this. So here's the blood calcium. Remember, normal is 9 to 11. So what's the problem here? Is blood calcium too low or too high? Too low or too high? It's too low. So which hormone am I going to release? PTH or calcitonin? PTH. And PTH is going to go to these three targets. What's going to happen at this target here? What's going to happen at the gut? I'm going to absorb more or absorb less? It's too low. What am I going to do? Absorb more or absorb less? I'm going to absorb more. What's going to happen here at the kidney? Am I going to excrete, get rid of more, or excrete less? I'm going to excrete less. And what's going to happen here at the bone? Am I going to deposit calcium or remove calcium from the bone? I'm going to remove it. So I'm going to take calcium from the bone and put it into the blood. And all three of those things are going to make blood calcium go up. Blood calcium is going to go up. Blood calcium is going to go up. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix the problem. But look, here's another problem. Look at this one. It's greater than 11. Normal is 9 to 11. So do I have too little or too much? I have too much. And so remember, we got these same three targets. So what's going to happen here at the intestines? Am I going to absorb more of what I ate or absorb less of what I ate? I don't want the calcium, so I'm going to absorb less. What about here at the kidney? I'm going to excrete. Do I excrete more or excrete less? I'm going to excrete more. And what about bone? Am I going to take it out on or put it into the bone? I don't want it in the blood, so I'm going to deposit it into the bone. And all three of those things are going to make blood calcium go down. So this would be like a quiz right here. So look, question number one is, what does PTH do at the bones? Well, we already know. What does PTH do at the bones? It makes you, wrong one, makes you take calcium out of the bone. So it's going to activate those osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are going to eat the bone and release the calcium. Same thing's true for all of these. So you should be able to figure out what's going to happen if PTH at the bone. What's going to happen with PTH at the gut? What's going to happen with PTH at the kidneys? What's going to happen with calcitonin at the bones? What's going to happen with calcitonin at the gut? What's going to happen with calcitonin at the kidneys? When you do that, you should get something that's like this. So Priscilla says, can you please go back? Go back to what, Priscilla? How far back do you want me to go? You mean this one? So this is like a quiz. So question number one is, what does PTH, what does it do at the bones? And the answer is, it causes the withdrawal of calcium from the bones. You go back, question number two is, what does PTH do at the GI tract? And the answer is, PTH increases the absorption of calcium at the GI tract. And so that's how they all work. Okay, so that's pretty much everything about bones. Anybody have any questions? So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some things that can go wrong with bones. So we're going to look at homeostatic imbalances. What can go wrong with bones? Well, one of the most obvious things that can go wrong with bones is that bones break. This is called a fracture. So if you look at this, this bone is broken. It's no longer stable. It's unstable. It's no longer supportive. It's no longer protective. We have to fix this. If we don't fix it, things are not going to work the way they're supposed to. Well, in order to talk about bone fractures, we classify them. It makes it easier to talk about, so we classify them. And when we classify them, we use these either-or classifications. So it's either this or it's that. It's either this or it's that. So it could be either displaced, which means that the bone, the ends are not lined up anymore. They're like this. They're not lined up. Or non-displaced, which means even though they're broken, they're still in the right place. It can be complete or incomplete. So a complete fracture goes all the way through the bone. But an incomplete fracture only goes part of the way through the bone, which means that some parts of the bone are still attached. It can also describe the direction of the fracture. And so there are several different directions. There's linear, which is long ways. There's transverse, which is across. But it could also be sort of a spiral fracture, or it could be a diagonal fracture. So we can have spiral and oblique. Another way to describe it is, do the bones poke out through the skin? So if they poke out through the skin, it's called an open fracture because you created an opening. And open fractures are more likely to have infections because there's an opening in the skin to allow bacteria to get in. If it's not penetrating the skin, it's called a closed fracture. So here are some examples of those fractures. So these are directions. You can also have fractures that describe what the bone looks like when it's done. So one way to describe it is it's called a compression fracture. In other words, it's squished. The bone is crushed. Another way to describe it is if the bone shatters. If the bone shatters and you have lots and lots and lots of pieces, it's called a comminuted fracture. And then we can also talk about how many breaks or fractures there are. So if there's only one, it's called a simple. If there's more than one, it's called compound. So we can see a lot of these fractures. And you can see them under the x-rays too. So look, this is still attached. So if I were to describe this, it's an incomplete fracture. I would say that this is displaced because it's not in alignment. It's supposed to have this alignment, but it has this alignment. Here's a comminuted fracture. So look, you have lots and lots and lots of little tiny pieces. There are some fractures which are so common that they have their own special name. One of these is called a green stick fracture. It sounds like a weird thing, but what it means is if I take a branch off of a tree and it's green, it's alive, and I break it, it doesn't snap in two. What happens is it snaps, but then there's a piece that is still attached. So you get a break, but there's still some part attached. So if you look at a green stick fracture, it looks like that. And if you blow it up, it looks like that. So yes, there's a fracture, but look, that part's still connected. And when you see that under a microscope, sorry, not under a microscope, under an x-ray, I guess I don't have a picture. But anyway, a green stick fracture, still some part is connected. Well, what holds it together? There's a green stick fracture right there. So that's a green stick. So what's holding it together right here, though, is collagen. Remember, that's what holds the bone together to begin with. And remember, young people have more collagen. Old people have less collagen. And so young people are a lot more prone to green stick fractures. Whereas you get older, there's less and less collagen. And so there's less and less holding the bone together. And so old people tend to get comminuted fractures. So if you take your little brother and your grandmother to the top of the stairs and you push both of them down the stairs, they're going to get very, very different injuries. Your little brother is going to get something like this, if there's any breaks at all. But this is what's going to happen to your grandmother. And so look at this. Which one of these do you think is easier to heal? This green stick or this comminuted? This heals very, very quickly, and it heals usually without any kind of displacement or weird thing going on, but this is not going to heal without help. You're going to have to help this some way to make it heal. And so you're going to have to put plates or screws or something to hold these things together. So, comminuted and green stick, young people, old people. Make sense to everyone? Again, some things are so common, they have their own name. One of the things that happens when people fall down is they put their arms out to catch their weight, and it breaks these two bones in the lower arm. Well, depending on if your hand is like this when you fall, or if your hand is this when you fall, you get different fractures. You can have an outward fracture, or you can have an inward fracture. They each have their own name. An outward fracture is called a Callus fracture. An inward fracture is called a Smith's. But again, both these bones, the radius is here, the ulna is here, they're both broken. It just depends on the direction that the break occurs. Another common fracture happens down here near the ankle, and that is both the bones in the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula, also break. This is called a Pott's fracture, and it often happens when you turn your ankle very hard. So you can see some of these fractures. So we have a Pott's and we have a Callus fracture. And then one more fracture I want to talk about happens across this. Remember, this is the growth plate. So if you damage the growth plate, you're going to damage growth. And so what can happen is you can wind up with one arm, one leg, whatever, one longer or bigger than the other one. You get uneven growth. You can also have growth normal on this side and not normal on this side. And so the shape of the bone can twist and turn. So that's what this looks like. You can see the growth plate here, and that's where the fracture occurred. There's what it's supposed to look like over here. So we classify these bone fractures. We also want to talk about healing. So I put this slide in here to show you how many blood vessels there are in bones. Bones are full of blood vessels. So when you break a bone, any of these breaks, you're going to tear the blood vessels that are in there too. And what you're going to get is bleeding. So the first thing that happens with any bone break is you get a lot of bleeding. So the bleeding can stay inside the periosteum. It can spread into the surrounding tissues. If it's an open fracture, the blood will come out and you'll bleed outside. Well, just like any time that you break blood vessels, if you don't fix it pretty quickly, this person will bleed to death. They'll bleed out. And so the very first step in any kind of fracture repair is going to be preventing more blood loss. So what we're going to get is we're going to get a clot. A clot is called a hematoma. So we're going to get a hematoma forming. And then what's going to happen is we immediately need to stabilize this, because the more it moves around, the more damage there is. And so very quickly, we're going to build this cartilage callus in here, sort of an internal skeleton in here. And then we're going to replace the cartilage with a bony callus. So this is bone, but it's spongy bone. So it's not very strong, but it's stronger than cartilage. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to replace the spongy bone with regular compact bone. We're going to do remodeling. So there are 4 stages in fracture repair. First one is this hematoma forms. So we get a clot. The site is going to swell up. It's going to turn bright red. It's going to get very, very inflamed, and it's going to hurt like crazy. But very quickly, these torn blood vessels are going to begin to repair themselves. But there's where the blood is happening. That's where our clot is going to form. So the blood vessels are very quickly going to begin to grow back. We're going to start putting cartilage in here. And so that's the second stage. We're going to get this fibrocartilage callus. So white blood cells are going to come in. They're going to remove the damaged tissue. We're going to start secreting collagen to hold the ends together. We're going to make this fibrocartilage. And it looks like this. So this is our fibrocartilage callus. And then what's going to happen is we're going to start replacing this with bone, spongy bone. So spongy bone is going to form. So if you look here, you can see the fracture. And look, there's the callus after it's formed. And then the next thing is we're going to replace that cartilage with bony callus, but remember it's spongy bone. And spongy bone is not nearly as strong as dense bone, but it is bone, it's spongy bone. By now, all the blood vessels have regrown, the periosteum has repaired itself, and we've got this bony callus in here. And you can see that here. So there's the fracture. There's this bony callus right here. And then finally, what's going to happen is we're going to get remodeling. And that happens in response to stressors like we talked about over and over, until finally it's going to resemble something like we started with. And so look, it's hard to tell exactly where the bone fracture happened. Now you can always tell it a little bit because it's thicker there. And believe it or not, this part is stronger than it was before. And so those are those stages. Any questions about the stages of healing? So look at this. They purposefully cut this bone. This is a mouse. But what they did is they cut the lower bone in the lower, or the bone in the lower leg, the fibula. And then they looked and see what happened over time to see what those stages were. And you can see all of the stages here as they form. If you look at this picture, this is a person, so obviously they didn't do this on purpose. But look, you can see these stages. So there's our callus that's forming, bony callus, remodeling. Sometimes we need to stabilize the bone. So we can use a cast, an external cast. That's used a lot. But sometimes they put pins in the bone and screws to hold it in place. So this is a shaft of metal that's driven right down the center of the bone through the medullary canal. And then what happens is it provides this place for these other bone parts to stay together so that they can reattach themselves together. So we can form this bony callus around it, and you can see it here. And then you can see the the cartilaginous callus, and then you can see the bony callus. Finally, you can see where remodeling is going on. So see if you can put these in the right order. Everybody try it. So this is a little self-quiz. So what order do you think these go in? Which one's first? So it goes D, C, B, A. So all I did was flip it around, but I could have just chopped it up and I couldn't put it in any order I want. So you need to be able to recognize this. But here's the hematoma, there's that fibrocartilage callus, there's the bony callus, and then here's remodeling. As I said, sometimes you need support. So it can be pins, it can be screws. This is a plate. And so this person probably had a comminuted fracture. You can see all these little fracture pieces in here. And so they have to put a plate in there. These things usually are left there. They're not removed. Now sometimes the screws will actually work themselves to the surface. If that happens, they do cut it open a little bit and pull it out. But otherwise, these things are just left in there. So you have these things in here throughout your life. Okay, let's look at a couple of more things that can happen to bones, and then we'll be finished. One of these we already talked about, and that's rickets. You remember, rickets happens in children. So Julia says, why don't you take them out? Well, because by taking them out, you'd have to go in and cut the bone or cut it open, and you'd have to, how would you get this out? You'd have to cut a hole in the bone to reach in there and get it out. So by removing them, you just create more damage than if you just leave them. And they don't do anything in here. They're inert to the body. They use titanium, and titanium is inert to the body, so we don't reject it. It doesn't cause inflammation or anything like that. So there's no reason to take it out unless you just have to. Okay, but back to this. So we already talked about rickets. Remember, rickets happens in children, and it's because of a lack of vitamin D. And then when you have a lack of vitamin D, you have too little calcium. And so their bones get very, very rubbery, and they bend and all that. Well, you can also have something similar in adults, but we don't call it rickets in adults. It's called osteomalacia, but it's the same thing. It's a lack of vitamin D and calcium. And so you get different symptoms, though, because the bones have already grown. So rickets is only in children. Osteomalacia is in adults. So if you look at rickets, this is what rickets look like. You get bowed legs, malformed bones. But with osteomalacia, you don't get that because the bones have already been built. You don't wind up with bowed legs. So if you look at an x-ray of rickets, it looks like this. Look at these bones. You can see just how misshapen the bones are. That's because they're rubbery. Remember when we took and we put the bones in vinegar, we said that the vinegar was going to leach out or remove the calcium. And what you wind up with is that bone that's very rubbery because all that's left is collagen. And so the weight of the person's body causes these to bow out because they're not strong, they're not stiff and supportive. But if you look at this one, you can see where the bone here is thin. And so remember, not only do you get this rubbery and malformation, the bones are thin. There's not much calcium in here. So this is also rickets because look, these are epiphyseal plates. So I know this is a child, and so the disease is rickets. But if you looked at an x-ray and there were no epiphyseal plates, the disease would be called osteomalacia. So it's the same basic disease, except the symptoms are different. Here's another disease. It's called osteoporosis. And so with osteoporosis, it's a different disease because what's happening here is you're reabsorbing calcium faster than you're depositing it. It mostly happens in spongy bone. And so the spongy bone is going to get very, very thin, very, very brittle. Normally, if you look at this cartoon, look, osteoblasts and osteoclasts, remember they work together. They reshape and remodel. But during osteoporosis, what happens is the osteoclasts are working at a much, much higher rate than osteoblasts are. And so we're going to remove bone a lot faster than we're going to deposit it. And when you do that, what happens is you lose bone mass. And so you lose bone mass. This is very common in women, and it happens much, much faster after menopause. It also happens in men, but not nearly as much. But look what happens to the person's height. They shrink. They shrink, and they also change their posture. Look, they bend forward because the front part of the body is heavier than the back part. And it pulls them over. The head, the trunk, everything pulls this way. And so you wind up with this curve in the spine, and you wind up with something like this, which is called the dowager's hump. If you go back and look at here, you can see this person's dowager hump right there. Well, when you bend over, look what happens to the height. And so you can lose 3 to 4, even more inches of height. Not only that, though, look what happens to the spongy bone. So here's the trabeculae of a normal person. Here's the trabeculae of osteoporosis. Look at that. Look how different that looks than this. So this looks pretty strong. There's a lot of bone mass there, but that looks very, very weak. And so fractures happen very, very easily. Any questions about osteoporosis? So look, normal osteoporosis. It looks like you could just crush this with just your fingers, and you probably could. Okay, there's one more disease that we're going to talk about. And this is what's called Paget's disease. So Paget's disease is kind of a weird disease because it's when you have too much bone, too much. Well, that sounds kind of weird. Sounds like it's a good thing to have a lot of bone, but it's not normal bone. It's haphazard, and so it forms in weird places. So it's an overgrowth of bone in weird places. Specifically, it's an overgrowth of spongy bone. It's most common in the spine, the pelvis, the leg, the femur, and then also in the skull. So look at this. There's normal, but here's Paget's disease. Look at all that bone, extra, extra bone. But does it look very strong? It's not strong. There's a lot of bone here, but it's weak bone. If you look here on this x-ray, this is a whole body scan. You can see these things here. These are called hot spots, and that's where there's too much of this bone. And look at it. Everywhere you have a hot spot like this, you lose function. So this person probably can't turn their head very much. They probably can't bend over here. Their hips don't work. And just like with Some other diseases, you can get malformations. It's a weird extra bone. And then again, these hot spots. And so this disease is very debilitating. Your fingers, your hands, your arms, your legs, your spine, everything quits working. Look at this person here. This is actually a famous painting. It's in the National Gallery. But look at her. This is a woman, and she has Paget's disease. Look at her hands, and then obviously look at her face. Everything is abnormal. But she wanted her portrait painted, and so they hired a portrait painter, and she had this done. The name of this painting is The Ugly Countess. Not a very nice name, but that's what it is. This guy also has Paget's disease. So look at this malformation. And look what the inside of his mouth looks like. Malformation. This person has Paget's disease. Look at this area here and here and here, and then also in the mouth. And then this person died, and they kept his skull. And here's his skull. Look at it. Doesn't look anything like a normal skull at all. So if you came along and you found this skull, and you didn't know this was disease, you might think that aliens visited the earth. Because they don't look like normal people. Okay, anybody have any questions? So that is the end of the material for this part. It's the end of the material for the first lecture exam. So the lecture exam opens, I think it's on Saturday. Let me look. Yeah, it opens on Saturday. Remember, they're not going to close, so you don't have to take it on Saturday, but please don't wait too long, because if you wait long, what's going to happen is you're going to get behind. There'll also be a lecture quiz that'll open this afternoon.